Hello and welcome. In the previous video in this series, or this playlist, I analyzed cantata number 25, and I showed how the opening chorus lasts 6 minutes, or Bach planned 6 minutes for that opening chorus. He didn't attain it exactly, but the opening chorus is planned to be 6 minutes, and then the two arias in cantata number 25 were planned to be 3 minutes each, to be half the duration, or to add up to the duration of the opening chorus. So if you haven't viewed that video, please do so. But I wanted to talk about speed, distance, and time in this video, because this is really the only way that one can possibly calculate all these things and do it accurately every time with no error. So you might recall from high school math the speed, distance, and time formulas here, which are speed equals distance divided by time. From that, we can derive distance equals speed times time, or speed multiplied by time. And then from those, we can figure out that time is distance divided by speed. And here are some examples. 40 miles an hour equals 80 miles divided by 2 hours. 40 equals 80 divided by 2. Here's an example of distance equals speed multiplied by time. 80 miles equals 40 miles per hour times 2 hours. 80 equals 40 times 2. Time equals distance divided by speed. Here's a good example. 2 hours equals 80 miles divided by 40 miles per hour. 2 equals 80 divided by 40. Now, speed, distance, time can all be translated into musical terms. Speed becomes tempo. Distance becomes beats. That is, the distance is the length, and the beats are the length. And that's like number of measures and beats. That's the length. And then time becomes duration. Here we're talking about hours. Here we're talking about minutes. So tempo, beats, duration is the same as speed, distance, time, or I should say analogous to that. So for an example, tempo equals beats divided by duration. 72 beats per minute equals 288 beats divided by 4. Beats equals tempo times duration. Example, 288 beats equals 72 beats per minute times 4 minutes. And then duration equals beats divided by tempo. Example, 4 minutes equals 288 beats divided by 72 beats per minute. Now these formulas here are as basic as they come in math. And I am convinced that Bach was able to do these basic calculations very quickly in his head. He didn't have to write it out or use calculators and that sort of thing. He could actually do this in his head, which leads me to the conclusion that Bach used primarily whole number durations in his music. Not always, but very often he would use a duration like 4 minutes or 6 minutes. For example, in cantata number 25, or 3 minutes. So it's not 4.2 minutes or 4.1 minutes or 4.5 minutes, but it's 4 minutes. And this is the reason why Bach often tried to give his durations whole number values, like 4 minutes or 6 minutes, because it's easier to calculate that way than if everything is a decimal or a fraction. So what he usually did was he would have a movement of a whole number duration, like 4, and then he would have another movement, maybe not of a whole number duration, like 240. 240 is 1/3 less than 4. So that's very common, actually. Very common would be a duration of 4 minutes and then 2 minutes and 40 seconds. So Bach had these formulas here at his disposal. He would these the speed distance time formulas have been around since the ancient Greeks. I mean, this is nothing new. And I do emphasize in a previous chapter in this book that I cite Christoph Wolff, the great Bach scholar from Harvard University. I really make a point to emphasize Professor Wolff's whole point in that Bach was a musical scientist. He was a composer who wrote works of musical science. He wasn't just a composer who just composed. Bach considered himself to be a musical scientist. And like Isaac Newton, Bach was like the Isaac Newton of music. And for anyone to be considered a musical scientist who creates works of musical science, it goes without question that one would have to rely on scientific formulas such as this. This is the backbone of Bach's system right here. He could figure out anything he wanted to figure out if he knew his beats and his duration. He could figure out the tempo, although that didn't occur because he always knew his tempo. So usually what would happen was Bach would always know his tempo and his desired duration that he wanted. And then from that, he would figure out the number of beats or number of measures that would bring him to the value that he wanted. So he simply would multiply the tempo by the duration and he got the beats. And then if he didn't know the duration, let's say if he were working with a previously composed work and he wanted to compose another movement that was related to that, then he could have set up an equation something like this to figure out, how long the second movement has to be with these number of beats and this tempo. So any way you look at it, Bach could have calculated anything he wanted to calculate using this formula for tempo, beats, and duration. And let me emphasize again that this was something Bach didn't have to write out and do on scratch paper and toil with for like an hour long before he did it. No, these are formulas he could have done in his head quickly, even with fractions and decimals. This is how smart Bach was, and this is how much of a scientist Bach was, is that he could easily calculate in his head using any of these formulas here. So with that being said, let's move on now and analyze a couple of more cantatas, and it's fascinating because I'm going to show you how Bach used two previously composed movements in a new cantata and then tailored his new movements to match the ones that he composed like a year before. It's really fascinating. So stay tuned for that, and thank you for viewing.